All right, well, thanks for joining me today. This has been a really cool conference, a lot of really good security talks, and so I'm really excited to be presenting here as well. So before we start, has anyone ever encountered discovering pods in their Kubernetes cluster that are cryptocurrency mining? Okay, we got a hand there. Okay, a couple hands. For those of you who didn't put your hands up, that's a good thing. This talk is about looking at some of the threat actors behind some of these cryptojacking campaigns and how they are taking advantage of misconfigured Kubernetes clusters. But before we dive into it, we have some terms and definitions to clear up. So this is Cryptobooty, cryptocurrency obtained from illicit coin mining in a Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to need everyone's help in making this a household term. A little background on myself. That'll give some context for this presentation. I'm not a software developer or DevOps by trade. Currently, I'm director of research at a company called Lacework. We're a startup in Mountain View, and we do cloud provider account security, Linux workload security, container and Kubernetes security. I've spent my career in InfoSec, started in the Air Force. Then I worked for an incident response firm called Mandiant. And then before Lacework, I was at another startup called ProtectWise, and there I ran our threat research team. So primarily, I've spent most of my time doing threat intelligence and analysis and forensics, particularly focusing on the network side of the house, now kind of pivoting in cloud security. So if these topics are interesting, be sure to follow me on Twitter. You can also send me emails, check out our blog as well. All right, so I have a few different goals for this talk. So first and foremost, did some research earlier in the year about major Kubernetes components that have been exposed to the internet. So we're going to dive into a brief overview of that research. Then we're going to look at an active cryptojacking campaign that we caught on one of our honeypots. Then we'll take a detour and talk about some of the active threat actor groups that are targeting cloud resources and how that relates to Kubernetes. And then we're going to tie this all together with the previous research to kind of get a sense of scale that some of these attacks may be operating. So when I first started doing some research around Kubernetes, a common theme in anything in the cloud is misconfigurations. So generally, this occurs from things like exposed S3 buckets, MongoDB open to the world. I feel like you hear about once every week that there's this new database that's been found with a bunch of sensitive information. So when we looked at Kubernetes specifically, we wanted to get an idea of what kind of scale are some of the internet-facing Kubernetes components. So to do that, some of the major components that we can see that accidentally get exposed to the internet are Kubernetes dashboard, the API server, both the secure port and the insecure port, etcd, and kubelet. So using some of the mass internet scanning tools like Shodan and Census, we can gather some stats around how frequently this occurs. Kubelet's the only one we didn't dive into. A lot of these scanning services didn't have anything that would pick up on kubelet, so we just focused on the dashboard API and etcd. So if you haven't done this before, you might have some questions on like how do you discover open dashboards, open APIs. So I just have a quick little demo so you can see what it's like. So things like Census, what they'll do is they crawl the internet, they look at open ports, and if they get any information back from crawling those, they'll go ahead and index that, and then security researchers or companies looking to protect their infrastructure can use that to see if they have exposure or other types of research. So when we look at the Kubernetes dashboard, which is kind of the starting point, at the end of 2018, there were multiple reports of major companies having exposed dashboards that resulted in things like cryptojacking and possible access to the cloud service provider. We focused our research there. So to find dashboards, one of the ways we can do this is we need something unique that would be returned in the crawling search results. So for our dashboard, it's HTML. We can use, there's a unique HTML element in a Kubernetes dashboard, and that's just Kubernetes dashboard. So this is what it looks like. Just searching Kubernetes dashboard here. This gives us a result of any IPs that match that search. And then we can go ahead and click on one of these guys and take a closer look. This dives into some of the open ports that they found, some of the whois information. And then we can actually go to the site. So in this instance, we end up discovering there's a dashboard here. This was in one of our first clicks. So what we end up doing is we use their APIs to go through and verify of those IP results, how many of those are actually dashboards. So after we wrapped up this research, what we ended up finding is on any given day, we'd see about 500 dashboards that had been exposed. We use Shodan to look at etcd clusters. Shodan actually makes it extremely simple. There's an interesting blog post that was written, and it's in the resource section of these slides. But within it, they describe how they use Shodan, looked at a bunch of these etcd clusters, and within the first 3, found evidence of credentials that were to access like AWS. So just because we see an etcd cluster doesn't necessarily mean that it's associated with Kubernetes, but a lot of times there would be metadata associated with the naming schemes that was Kubernetes themed. The other thing that we look at is API server. So specifically, there's the secure port, which is essentially how the API server operates using TLS, goes to the regular authentication authorization. This is the lower risk item of these 4, but there's still some sort of risk of exposure there. And then probably the highest risk item is finding over 600 API servers serving on the insecure port. If you're not familiar with that, that's served via HTTP, and that goes past your authentication and authorization modules. So anyone with access to this can just compromise your entire cluster. So kind of the next step here that we wanted to take is, okay, this is interesting. We've got some stats on these misconfigurations. Usually it's surprising because you wonder, like, okay, how do you have the insecure API server expose the internet? Like, how did these missteps happen? But then the next big question we have is, like, is anyone actually specifically targeting Kubernetes? Are they going after that as one of the platforms and applications that they commonly target? So we wanted to figure out, based on this exposure, if that's being exploited. One of the key questions is, if we set up a honeypot that's wide open to the world, how long would it take to actually compromise it? If you set up, say, an old version of Redis that's vulnerable to critical CVEs that are remote code execution, you can probably bet on that being exploited within a couple hours to 24 hours. The other thing we want to know is, what's going to be the best way to actually set up this honeypot, the easiest way that we can do it, and also minimize the blast surface in case we have any issues. And then didn't find any major reports detailing these type of attacks, but is there anything else we can kind of surface up? So I came across this blog post, and it's titled An Overview of MicroK8s, a tool to quick start Kubernetes cluster, and why using it in the cloud was a terrible idea. So background, if you don't know Kubernetes, or if you don't know MicroK8s, it's a single node Kubernetes cluster. They're very clear on the website about it being used for local lockdown environment. It's primarily used for development, prototyping, these type of things. So using it in this way kind of goes against how it's supposed to be used. But the author details how he went ahead and did this, and then after some period of time, he saw a bunch of pods that were doing some cryptocurrency mining. So here, this is a listing of the pods on their cluster, and you'll see a bunch of these weird named pods, and you'll see this as kind of a current theme in some of the other areas that we looked at. And just so you know, at this blog, there was a lot of comments about it. A lot of people who work with MicroK8s are like, hey, you're not supposed to use it like that. Like, what are you doing? But at the end of the day, there's a PR request to make sure to bind that to localhost. I found another blog post that was about cryptojacking, but it was focused on Drupal. And then someone chimed in one of the comments, and they're like, hey, I saw something really similar to this. And it was microcates, and I threw it on the cloud, and it got compromised right away. So if you take a look here, what we have is there's a couple of curl commands that download some files, and then those files are ultimately executed. This is a really common theme that you'll kind of see as we take a look at the threat actors that are actually behind this. Then something funny I thought is, in conclusion, do not install microcates with its default configuration on a server exposed to the internet. So now we have a pretty good idea of how we want to set up our honeypot. Microcates looks like it's a good one to use. So to do this, all we need to end up doing is spin up an Ubuntu server, install microcates via snap, enable the Kubernetes dashboard, check, make sure that that insecure API is accessible, and expose internet traffic to it, and then put a few tools to monitor what's happening on the host. And then disclaimer, microcates isn't supposed to be used like this, so use that at your own risk. So my expectation from reading some of those blogs is that there'd be an attack, occurring somewhat immediately, within 24 hours, maybe 48 hours. But all we ended up seeing initially is just a lot of internet scanning. In fact, we would see a lot of exploit attempts for completely unrelated applications. I was about to give up on it, and then on day 31, we finally saw some activity. And my hypothesis was, insecure API or the dashboard would be the infection vector, but we didn't really see any interaction with the dashboard, so that was kind of interesting. So right here, this is just a Wireshark screenshot of traffic to the insecure port for the API server. You can see that this is in clear text HTTP. And the responses are with the API paths. And then on day 31, we see a new user agent, and that's kubecontrol. So now we know that someone knows that this is Kubernetes, and they're actually kind of diving into it and interacting. So what the attacker ends up doing here is they enumerate all the API paths, and then eventually we see this post request. And so what this post request is doing is creating a replication controller, which we thought that was kind of interesting as opposed to using something like a replication set. And then within this replication controller, we see 5 replicas. We see them use a CentOS image, and then we see that same kind of chained curl commands, where here they're downloading the files and then going ahead and executing them. One of the things I thought interesting about this is I assumed that they would probably pull down a backdoored image or an image of a miner, but instead they use a clean image and then install after that. This is a closer look at some of the pods. And now we start to see some overlap with some of the previous reporting. One thing to note is we see this container name, myresdo2, that comes in a little bit later. But we're starting to see IP addresses that are the same ones that we saw in previous reporting. And then something to also point out is these files are being pulled down. That's XMRig. And XMRig is an open source Monero miner that's popularly used by the bad guys. It's also used for good. And then that configuration file is just the configuration file to set up the mining pools, Monero address, etc. This is what that configuration file looks like. So highlighted there is the Monero address. And that actually ends up being the same one that we saw in one of our microcates blog comments. And then these IP addresses are some private mining pools that the attackers are using, also seen in those comments, so seeing a lot of overlap and a lot of ties here. So now that we've captured a successful attack on our honeypot and we're kind of tying a few of the pieces together, we kind of need to take a little bit of a step back and talk about some of the attackers. So if you're not part of the InfoSec world, generally we think of threat actor groups in a number of different categories. These are 3 of the most predominant ones. And usually they're separated by what end objectives are. So in this case, we have criminal groups. They're after financial, monetary gain. This is things like obtaining credit cards, selling PII, ransomware. And with the groups that are specifically targeting the cloud, in that case, it's cryptocurrency mining, specifically Monero. APT, you've probably heard of APT before. That's Advanced Persistent Threat. These generally are groups that are associated with a nation state in carrying out their objectives. This tends to be economic espionage. This also tends to be stealing proprietary information. And then lastly, we have our hacktivists. These are politically motivated groups, and generally what they're trying to do is disrupt or deny services to their targets. So for the interest of this presentation, what we're actually going to be looking at is within those criminal actor groups, specifically criminal actor groups that are targeting cloud resources. And they have a lot of things in common. One, they're primarily focused on mining Monero right now. They have a similar set of attack chains. So generally this starts off with scanning the internet for vulnerable services, looking for applications that might be vulnerable to some remote code exploits, or brute forcing passwords for other applications. Generally, once they get in, a common method that we see is an install script is downloaded. This is usually like on a Linux system. This is just a bash script. And the bash script usually takes care of a lot of work. It does things like downloads further binaries. Usually those binaries will be something like a rootkit that downloads modules. Those modules might be things like a propagation module to move laterally, or something like xmrig to actually mine the cryptocurrency. Usually these scripts will also establish persistence. So on Linux hosts, this is typically done through cron jobs that repeatedly download the install script. Sometimes this is through setting up services. One of the most fascinating parts, and I have another talk on it, is they actively target other threat actor groups and try and kill off other miners if they're present. So there ends up being a battle, especially on these really easy to exploit hosts, where they try and kill their processes, sinkhole their infrastructure, and things like that. So there's kind of three main groups that I want to highlight. There's the 8220 mining group. This is a Chinese-speaking threat actor. They've also gone by the name 8220 Gang. They've been active since 2017. Their methods typically compose of hosting malware on things like Pastebin and GitHub. They've also been known to backdoor Docker images. We see a lot of malicious shell scripts. ELF binaries primarily use xmrig to do their actual Monero mining. Use this tool called Process Hider to achieve rootkit functionality on servers that they compromise. Now, their main targets are generally web applications. But something interesting to note here is we've also seen them target Docker, so open Docker APIs. This is something we haven't really seen a lot of some of these other groups do. Some characteristics unique to them is that their C2s often use TCP Port 8220 to communicate, hence where the name of the group came from. A lot of their malware, they kind of keep with the same names. So generally when you have a botnet, a lot of times what you might do is continually not really change that naming scheme, and that's how some of the other groups can actually target the processes that they want to kill. They do heavy use of a lot of the domains that they use are .tkTLDs. That kind of makes them stick out. But they got their origins from a GitHub repo containing illicit coin mining tools called WhatMiner. So apologies for the pixelated image. But this one's kind of funny because it doesn't disguise what it's used for. So it straight up says collecting and integrating all different kinds of illicit mining malware. And so one of the other things I'll point out too is you see these folders, kworkerd and Sistas. That's generally some of the naming schemes that they use for their malware as well. So next is Rock. If you're familiar with CrowdStrike, they have these really cool characters of the different threat actor groups. Since there aren't really ones for the cloud ones, right now I'm using this picture of the Rock. So this is another Chinese-speaking threat actor. They've also been referred to as Iron Group or System 10, active since about 2018. A lot of similar methods to 8220 Mining Group. A few different changes there, things like using HFS and AMIs, but a lot of the same kind of methods. Early on, they're targeting pretty heavily both Windows and Linux, and they were doing a little bit more ransomware at the beginning. We see them coding their malware in a variety of languages, such as Python and Go as well. A lot of their targets are the same, but I haven't found any reporting of them targeting Docker or Kubernetes specifically. A couple things that are unique to them is we've seen a lot of they're adopting new tactics as they go. So originally they would use GitHub to host malware, and then they started using their own infrastructure to host malware. And then most recently doing new things like using C2 for DNS. So seeing some changes there. Probably the thing that was most interesting to me is there was someone that reported that they were specifically uninstalling cloud security tools. This came out around March 2019. And this was like AV tools associated with Alibaba and Tencent. Now, they have a really interesting beginning because they're reported to have forked the WhatMiner repo that 8220 Mining Group did. And essentially all they did is forked it, and then they replaced all the infrastructure with their own. So there wasn't a huge deviation there. The name actually comes from a MinerGate wallet and login that rock at live.cn. Last group to highlight, don't know as much about them. There's a company called Azure that's doing a lot of reporting. So these guys are pretty interesting for a couple reasons. They're another Chinese-speaking threat actor, first reporting in 2018. Pretty similar methods. A lot of times their malware will do some of the things that normally the other groups' shell scripts will do. Similar targets. But something I found pretty interesting is these guys heavily target ROC. So for example, one of their pieces of malware has this whole list of IP addresses that are associated with ROC infrastructure. And then what it does is it sinkholes those on the host. So we see a lot of targeting of them specifically. The other thing is they also seem to kind of adopt some of the ROC tactics pretty quickly. So they also were observed shortly after ROC actually uninstalling the same cloud security tools for Alibaba and Tencent. The malware analysts at Azure have also reported that they use a little bit more advanced techniques for some of their Linux malware. Okay, so now that we've kind of got a good idea of who some of these threat actors are, what some of their objectives are, and we've talked about how we have these different misconfigurations that are open there. We've seen how our own honeypot has also been compromised. What we want to do now is revisit that original research and kind of see what we can do to tie all of this together. So if we revisit our research looking at the insecure APIs, so at the time of research, we saw about 678 different IPs in our census search that hit on some of the ways that we were searching for the insecure APIs. This was mostly on TCP Port 8080 and 443, so that's something important to point out. Using these search engines, if these were being served on an unusual port, they wouldn't necessarily pick that up. We primarily see these in various clouds like Amazon, GCP, OVH, Tencent, and Alibaba. So what we went ahead and did is we took a look at the pods that were running, and we found that there's about 10,743 different pods. And we started doing some analysis around what those pods look like to see if it tied back to anything else that we saw. So immediately we see a lot of these unusual naming schemes. This one in particular we saw in that screenshot earlier when we were talking about that blog post that we were reading. We see these common labels and container names, myresd02 and myresd01. That's what we saw within the pod specification on our honeypot. And then when we rack and stack these pods, the most popular image that's being run is CentOS. So we're already starting to see a lot of indicators of compromise there. But kind of the most important piece is looking at some of these commands that are used for the containers. So found several repeating as 5 distinct different sets of curl commands and executing a file. And if we kind of take a closer look, we'll see that this IP address that xmrig and its configuration file are being downloaded from was the same IP address that we saw in our honeypot. We see that this one is being downloaded from an IP address over TCP Port 8220, and that's a pretty strong TTP associated with the 8220 mining group. Another one is we see this IP address as well with that same TCP Port 8220, and this was also seen in one of the MicroK8's blog. These are 2 other distinct curls that we saw. Interestingly, most of these were coming from a hard-coded IP address, but we did see one that was downloaded straight from GitHub. But if we take another look at this, we see some file naming that's pretty consistent with the 8220 mining group. And then we also see, again, this IP address that was also in our honeypot. So that kind of wraps up the research as far as doing a full circle. But what we end up seeing is out of that 10,000, there's 4,450 of these pods are doing illicit coin mining, specific to that description that we showed. We're still doing a little bit more analysis on this because it looks like there's multiple campaigns going on here, but just for this one particular group, about half of those pods have been in mining Monero for them. So just a couple final thoughts here before we wrap up. The real purpose of this research is to illuminate misconfigurations that occur and the attackers taking advantage of them. And really the main purpose of this is so we can share this information so operators can use it to avoid falling victim. So if you ever come across activity like this, you can always reach out to me. We can give you some information on what we might think it's associated with, or if you have concerns that maybe you have some exposure and you want to learn a little bit more, we can help out there. This also gives us confirmation of criminal threat actors specifically targeting Kubernetes. And that was kind of one of the goals first starting out is, are people really targeting Kubernetes specifically? In this research that we did, we have, with pretty high confidence that this is probably attributed to the 8220 mining group. And I think we didn't really talk too much about this, but if any of these actors were actually to do any of this manually, as opposed to doing it completely automated, it's possible that a Kubernetes cluster may contain, secrets to something like AWS that they could pivot into and then have much more resources. As far as we know, that hasn't been occurring, but we don't know for sure because we're just kind of looking at the surface here. So with that, I have a number of resources. These, I uploaded this to the schedule. I'll also put it on our blog, but there's a lot of cool articles that go into depth about some of these threat actors. And then from there, we'll do any questions. Yeah, and then if you could come up to the mic.
What license did they use for their repo?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. That's pretty good. I need to figure that out so I can work that in.
They had a license file in the screenshot.
Yeah, so I got that screenshot. I think Palo Alto had a report, maybe it was Cisco Talos, that was doing like a digest on some of these groups, and they were talking about the origin of it. Yeah, that was pretty good. Any other questions?
What currencies are they mining?
Okay, so the question is, what currencies are they mining? We almost see exclusively Monero. I actually haven't seen any Bitcoin. Occasionally, I've come across a few reports of some currencies that I actually haven't heard of, some off-brand and weird ones. But one of the other things is when they mine Monero, Monero is a really good one for them to use because it helps them in their transaction remain a lot more anonymous. But they tend to use their own private mining pools, and then those get reshared a lot, so it's a little bit easier to track. We usually don't see them using public mining pools, which I think is kind of interesting. Anybody else? All right, cool. Feel free to email me anytime if you do come up with any other questions or want to learn more. Thanks, everybody.